Just waiting as people trickle in. I wanted to welcome everyone to our webinar today with Stephanie Camp and Laszlo Bock. My name is Rita Cedre, and I'm part of the marketing team here at SeekOut. I am sitting in Austin, beautiful and sunny Austin, Texas right now. So if you want to share in the chat where you're joining us from, I would love to see where all of y'all sit. Probably have quite an international crowd joining us today. We have Houston, Miami, Dallas, oh my God, San Bruno, just so many places. Wonderful. From India. Well, thank you all. Thank you for sharing and thank you for joining us. We're really thrilled to have you. We have an amazing program. So before we introduce Steph and Laszlo, I just wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping. The first is just the agenda for the event. We have a 30-minute conversation first with Laszlo and Steph, and then we will open the floor up for questions. But you absolutely do not need to wait until the 15-minute Q&A to submit your questions. You can submit your questions through the chat anytime throughout the webinar. I will be the friendly person in the chat, sharing some useful links and also some prompting questions so that we can keep the conversation lively and interesting for all of us. And so as you have questions while Laszlo and Steph are chatting, please feel free to submit them and through the chat, and I will be sharing those with Steph directly. For those of you who have not found the chat yet, I think most of you have, it's the little kind of chat thought bubble that is in the lower bar of your Zoom webinar window. Wonderful. Okay, so that's all I have for housekeeping. Without further ado, I want to introduce Stephanie Camp and Laszlo Bock.
Hi, I am Steph Camp. I'm the CMO of SeekOut. Welcome. I'm thrilled to also welcome Laszlo Bock. Laszlo built and led Google's people function for 10 years, from 6,000 employees to 72,000 employees around the world. During his tenure, Google was named the best company to work for, not once, not twice, but 30 times. And Laszlo is also the best-selling author of Work Rules. He's also an advisor at SeekOut. Welcome, Laszlo.
Steph, thanks. It's great to be here and great to be with everyone watching this and listening and joining the conversation.
So I'm going to kick off with a question from our audience, which is, what is your favorite interview question?
So I'm going to cheat. There's two. My favorite, the one I use every single time in every interview, is super boring. And it's tell me about an especially difficult problem you had to solve. And the reason that I use that every single time is, number one, general cognitive ability predicts 27% of job performance, the biggest single predictor. So it gives me a sense of that. The second is I get meta information about how hard a problem somebody thinks something was. And if they say, well, I put my shoes on this morning, I'm going to probably not hire that person. So it's the correct, based on science, question to ask. But then once that's out of the way, I just love going deep and really getting to know and understand people and understanding what shaped their values, what drives them. Those are nice to knows and, make me want to work with the person more. But my favorite every single time is give me an example of a particularly difficult problem you solved.
I like that. Mine is similar. It's a tell me about a time. Tell me about an extraordinary customer experience. But the spin is that you were the customer. And I like that question because it helps me calibrate on what someone thinks of as extraordinary, but also in marketing, so much of what we do is customer experience. So it helps me understand how people think about customer experience, how they value it. And it's a question I ask pretty much every single interview.
It's a great one. I will add that to my rotation.
Great. Okay, so Google today has one of the most recognized and respected employer brands. But when you joined and before you joined, that wasn't always the case. So can you tell us about the early days of Google and how did you find great tech talent when Google was a relatively unknown brand?
Yeah, so I started interviewing at Google in 2005 and I was hired in 2006. I think it was almost 6 months later. And I was at GE before. And I remember my CEO at GE saying, hey, we'll hold your job for you if this Google thing didn't work out, because Google was this like relatively small company, a few thousand people when I started interviewing, 6,000 when I joined, and it was viewed as risky and wasn't well known. And then I moved out to California, and just about every single person I met had interviewed at Google or known somebody who had interviewed at Google, and they all said it sucked. They said, I never got feedback. It took 20 interviews. They didn't follow up. I didn't know what the job was. The people weren't prepared. So it was a hot mess. But the advantage was the one thing underneath it was there was a sense of we got to hire really great people. And, the definition of that was a little messy, but it was a mess. And so when I joined, the first thing I wanted to do was actually understand exactly what predicts performance, because on my first day, I went to like 2 hours of new employee orientation, then the executive management team meeting. And in the afternoon, we then spent time reviewing candidates, which we did every Monday afternoon for, 2 to 4 hours. And candidates were getting screened out because of their GPAs and test scores and where they went to college. And I thought that was wrong. So what began then was a multi-year effort to figure out what actually predicts performance. How do you make equitable and fair hiring decisions? And how do you look beyond these kind of things that most companies actually look for that don't end up really mattering in terms of how people perform?
So what did you find was the best predictor of hiring success?
Well, what we found, the best predictors were, and we built sort of our hiring criteria around these: general cognitive ability, which I mentioned before, just how smart someone is. But the thing is, it doesn't show up in grades. It doesn't show up in test scores. I mean, it does. If you get a perfect SAT, you're not going to be like at the bottom of the barrel in terms of intellect. But there's a bunch of people who don't test well, who don't peak in high school, who don't peak in college. And it's just wrong to overlook that talent. So there's ways to test for general cognitive ability. The second was leadership experience. And we define that very specifically as emergent leadership, not just, did I run a team, but did I step in and lead when I was needed? And just as importantly, did I give up that power and let somebody else lead? We ended up defining the culture. There's a long story there, but the short one is we eventually defined Googliness as a combination of conscientiousness, which predicts 7% of job performance, and intellectual humility, which means not just, not that I'm necessarily humble, but that I can admit when I'm wrong, which is critical. And the least important was actually, do they have the content expertise? And so we built our whole hiring process around these criteria. And then we'd actually test it every 2 years to make sure that we were continuously hiring better and better people each year.
I love the term conscientiousness. Can you talk about like, how can you tell someone's conscientious in an interview?
So in an interview, it's the same way you actually laid out your interview question. Give me an example of a time when. Behavioral interview questions actually are, the most predictive thing of job performance, if you're trying to do an assessment, and the most predictive technique, I should say, is a work sample test. So have someone actually do the work and then see how they do. And that works really well for very structured, repetitive jobs like call centers or copy editing or things like that. Less well for engineering, where the job could be all over the place. So in the absence of that, the next best thing is to use structured interview questions where you kind of say, what am I assessing? And I'm going to ask for examples, and I'm going to assess that against a rubric of what good, bad, and indifferent. But examples of conscientious behavior, for example, are there's relatively trivial ones like, do people leave their coffee cups in the offices when a meeting is over? Do they push the chairs back in? There's more elaborate ones like when something falls through the cracks, do they jump in to do it? There's more subtle things like, do they need a lot of follow-up, or do they just kind of run with things on their own? So those are the kinds of things, the behaviors you would look for to test conscientiousness.
Great. Can you talk about, so Google's employee value proposition changed a lot from the time that you were there, I believe. Can you talk about how you helped develop that employee value proposition?
Yeah, the underlying idea that they got right at Google, and actually that SeekOut got right too, and is one of the reasons I was so excited to get to know everyone here and get connected to the company, is you have to start with a meaningful purpose. You have to start with a mission that matters. Google, at the end of the day, is just an advertising company. I mean, there's a lot of great things you hear about all that's done and lives that are changed in small businesses, but Google makes its money by selling ads, just like a TV station, just like the New York Times. But that gets wrapped in this mission of organize all the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. And even though we never talked about that in the interview process, every single person who got hired by the company from 2006 through 2016, they knew that message. They could articulate it because the marketing and the storytelling about the company was not how we make money or what the technology is. It was, we're going to make information free. And that had the added benefit of attracting a certain kind of person. So there was a selection bias where people who were motivated by that were drawn to it. So that was the underlying value proposition. And then we eventually elaborated that into, or expanded that into what it meant for employees. And we actually identified that there were 3 elements that drove value for employees and defined the culture: meaning, transparency internally, and giving people voice.
And what advice do you have for organizations? We have a lot of organizations joining this call. What advice do you have for people in those organizations to help develop and refine their employee value proposition? I think we hear from our customers that they're often competing for talent with a similar value proposition. So how do you advise them to stand out?
So the most effective thing, I'll give you like the answer, but then I'll give you the science behind it because it's really kind of interesting. The most effective way to draw a connection to purpose in your business is not to have a corporate retreat where people talk about vision and value statements and things like that. It's to think really hard about who is the end person impacted by the work you were doing. Who's the actual human being at the very long end of all the work you're doing. So healthcare is a place where it's easy to draw that connection. But there's other industries, for example, like plumbing and sanitation. You know, on the one hand, it's like septic and treatment of, human waste and things like that. And, it just, and very mechanical, like building pipes and monitoring water quality. But another way to think about it is you're actually saving lives and keeping people healthier and, making modern civilization possible. And so the best way to figure that out is to go talk to whoever in your organization at the very front line and say, who are the human beings being impacted, and to gather those stories and ask, and then turn those into the narratives and stories you tell your people. And the reason that all matters is there's 2 pieces. One is Amy Rosinski, who's a professor at Yale University, did work on, do people find meaning in work? And what she found is only 1/3 of people actually find their work meaningful. So the way it breaks down is roughly 1/3 find work meaningful. And by the way, this is true across professions you would think are meaningful, like nursing and medicine, clergy. I remember once talking to somebody who was in the ministry, and he said, it's easy to remember the duty and forget the joy. So even the most meaningful jobs can start to seem less meaningful. And so 1/3 of people find work meaningful. 1/3 of it roughly view the work as a means to an end. I got to make money. I'm just going to put in my hours. And 1/3 of people view it as a game. It's a ladder to climb. I got to get the next level, the next promotion. I got to beat these other people at my company. So that's Amy's research, and it's fascinating. But Adam Grant, who's at the University of Pennsylvania, found people who find work meaningful are between 10 and 21% more productive, which means if you can connect your recruiting to meaning, and you can select for people who find purpose in the work, you can get a 10 to 20% boost in productivity, and you're going to be surrounded by people who are less likely to backstab and things like that. It also means there's an opportunity for your existing employees to identify what they need and what they want, and help them find that meaning in the work they're doing.
Can you talk more about how you select for meeting? Like, how do you find people, this 1/3 of folks that do find purpose in their work, so that you're optimizing for a more productive and more purpose-driven workforce?
You start by putting it out in the world. Companies run a lot of marketing talking about kind of the good things they do, and in the US, we have sort of different thematic months. We have Black History Month, and as an example, and large corporations will run a whole bunch of ads talking about everything they're doing to support it, but their actions don't actually support that in a lot of cases, support the causes they're talking about. And so you have to actually tell that story, and then you actually have to live that story, not just once a year, or, for a month, a year, or on a special day, but you have to live it throughout the year. You have to continue doing this stuff. And it's not just corporate philanthropy. You just actually have to, figure out what's meaningful, whether it's, saving lives, or, lifting up businesses, or educating people, or housing people, whatever it is, feeding people. There's like basic human needs. So you tell those stories, and they have to be backed by reality. It can't just be marketing spin. And when that happens, people will be drawn to you. And the people you will get will be the missionaries. And you can find those people as well if you have the right tools to look deep in their backgrounds and see signals for it. So for example, people who are more mission driven will tend to have volunteer activities on their resumes. They'll tend to have philanthropic things on their resumes. And those are things actually that often companies screen against. They don't look for those things actively. But if you can find those signals, you're more likely to find people who are mission oriented and bring them into your company.
That's really interesting. So once you've put that mission, you've dialed into what the purpose is, and you've put it out in the world. What advice do you have for people to make sure that they find those right people? How do you go about finding those people?
Well, to be honest, part of it is, and this is why I'm here today and why I got to know you and the rest of the folks at SeekOut. It's really hard to look through those signals if you're just using kind of conventional methods. And, we had an enormous recruiting team when I was at Google, and you would just scrape the internet, and you'd go on all the different sites you can imagine and try to compile profiles and pull things together. And it was phenomenally difficult to kind of develop a cohesive view of the individual. But for example, if you're trying to hire technical talent, you don't want to look at just technical achievements. You want to ask about things like, and screen for things like, not just, everything they've done on GitHub, but all the things they've done for other people on GitHub. Do they do code reviews? Do they get asked to review? Do they get pulled into reviewing other people's technology and things like that? And those are all signals of not just conscientiousness that I mentioned earlier, but that these are people who believe in something, who want something more. And by the way, it's fine to just work for work's sake, right? You got to make a living. That's fine. It's fine to play the game and want to climb the ladder to the top. That's totally cool too. But the people who are motivated by meaning, if you can sift them out of the stack by sort of looking across the entire internet in a way that SeekOut does, and bringing that all together, so you can just say in one place, okay, they did some volunteer work, they did some philanthropy, whether it was in college or later, they reviewed other people's code. It makes it much, much easier to find those people and reach out and attract them.
Great, thank you. So I'm curious, what was your biggest learning from your time at Google?
I think the single biggest thing, well, there were a lot, but among the biggest, I think, would be that if you give people freedom, they will amaze you. So I was actually born in communist Romania and came to the US as a refugee when I was very young, and grew up, obviously, I'm immigrant refugee parents, didn't know about corporations, didn't know about big business, things like that. And but the reason my family came was because, in the 1970s, America stood for freedom from communism, the Warsaw Pact, all this kind of thing. And by and large, it's held up. But then I always wondered when I was working, when I was early in my career, I always felt like, oh, I want to be able to do more. How come I have to fix the copier? How come I have to do another stupid spreadsheet? I could bring so much more to it. And a lot of people could bring a lot more to their jobs than they're being asked to or given the freedom to. And so then eventually I ended up at Google, where there was a chance to actually experiment with this and see, what happens if you, number one, prioritize hiring good people, not just in terms of their capabilities, but in terms of their ethics and values, because they're mission driven and want to do the right thing. And by the way, no company's perfect. Google and I have screwed up a bunch of things, but at the 90% level, good people who are motivated by good things. And then you kind of get out of their way, you give them freedom. And I remember after 9/11 happened, September 11th, the attacks on the World Trade Center in the United States, the way the internet worked was there were just articles everywhere. Like, you go to the CNN website and NBC website and the BBC website, and they all have their own articles. And there were two people standing in line at a cafe, and one person complaining to each other about how hard it is to do all that. And an engineer in line behind them said, well, I could just build something to scrape all that together and consolidate. And that became the Google News product. And now you have Apple News and all these kind of consolidation points that let you sift through everything and figure out, okay, this is the most important, most reputable source. And that came from giving people freedom. So I think that's the biggest lesson, that it works at scale, and people are fundamentally good and will surprise you.
I love that. A lot of what you talk about is really universal and works at any time. But I'm curious to hear in this moment, like, what are some changes you expect to see in the talent landscape that will impact the folks listening in here?
Well, first of all, with apologies to anyone who is in the tech industry, as I continue to be, I think the tech industry really shot itself in the foot over the last couple of years in terms of retaining talent and honoring a commitment to employees. I mean, at the end of the day, companies are companies. They exist to make money, is in addition to the mission. But at the end of the day, like I said, Google's an advertising company. Facebook or Meta is an advertising company. Microsoft sells software, right? They're great companies, but they're just companies. But tech had, for the last 2 decades, really focused on saying, no, we're different. We're missionaries and we treat people differently. And I think despite how generous some of the compensation packages have been when people have been separated, the manner in which it has done has just been brutal, and broken an implicit contract where employees kind of said, this place is different. And tech's revealed itself to be just kind of, no, it's like other industries. So what that means is there's a huge recruiting opportunity, because there's a bunch of, pissed off, disaffected tech workers who are unhappy with their existing employers. And there's, 5 to 10 to 15% have been laid off from these companies, but there's another 85 or 90% who look around and say, this is not what I thought it was. So it's kind of an amazing time to recruit technical talent from the technology industry. By the way, same thing with startups. Venture capital funding is drying up, so people aren't going to startups. So this is, if you're healthcare, aerospace, manufacturing, consumer packaged goods, this is an amazing time to build great technology teams on your side. So I think that's one of the biggest things going on. The second is, and this is controversial, I do not think remote work will last forever. I think we're going to eventually settle into people being fully on site or hybrid. 2-3 days a week on site. And so there's another opportunity there, because if your company tolerates and will make a commitment to remote work, there's going to be a bunch of remote workers who are out of work as companies continue to pare back. And at the same time, if you can create a super compelling environment for your workers today, you can attract people, because the downside to remote work is it's lonely. I mean, there's lots of upsides, right? I get to wear pajamas all day. I, have a lot of flexibility. I can set my own schedule. That's all great. I don't have commute time, but it's fundamentally incredibly lonely. And it's also incredibly difficult to have a meaningful corporate culture if everyone's distributed. So again, enormous opportunity for recruiting, because at the end of the day, the way it gets discussed right now is sort of an us versus them, corporations against people who want to be free. But I think it's a case of human beings are social animals, and it's not going to be the corporations that force people back, though they're trying. I think for a lot of people, it's going to be wanting to actually be with other people and feel apprenticeship and experience that, and invest early in your careers and things like that.
Interesting. We have tons of questions from the audience. Thank you so much for adding all of your questions. We're going to move to them. Before we do, my final question to you before we move on is, anything else you think our listeners should know about attracting tech talent today?
Well, the only other thing I'd add is my job at Google. I mean, everyone's job is hard, but we had, by the time I left, thousands of recruiters, thousands. And it was a hard job, because the brand is great. People eventually want to work at Google after, there was a lot of recognition, but it was just a very manual hand-to-hand combat kind of situation, where I remember we used to do analyses about, well, we've talked to 80% of the engineers in the Bay Area, And there's only, 5% moving each year, which means our available market supply of engineers is so low. So we have to open other offices because we've actually interviewed everybody already. I think what's really different now, and one of the things that I love so much about SeekOut is there's tools in SeekOut about how to actually find people and make these connections. We always wanted to hire more veterans, and it was almost impossible to train hiring managers on what to look for in recruiters and what's the right security clearance and how do the military job codes translate to, to the corporate world. Right now in my area, nurses are under pressure everywhere, and it's incredibly hard to find skilled nurses. And as you all probably know, this whole thing of like, I can't remember what it's called, but nurses who sort of go on contract and move around the country wherever the need is greatest and the pay is high. It's really hard to find these skilled positions. And so I just think what's really special about today is there's the technology, thanks Steph to you and the team, that actually makes it a lot easier and possible to find all these remarkable people.
Great. And is that what drew you to be our advisor? I know you had a lot of choices of work tech companies to advise. I'm curious if that's it, or if it was something else that drew you to be an advisor to us.
That was a big part of it. And actually, yeah, as you'd guess, like there's a lot of, given my background, I mean, it's crazy given where I started, but I was asked to advise a lot of companies in this space. But so part of it was the technology and the vision of, not just what SeekOut does today, but where you're going in the future. But I have to be honest, the second part was Anoop, your CEO and founder, and Claire, who runs product, and people like you. But I just remember spending time with Anoop and saying, this is somebody who's not just trying to build a business because he wants to, build a big tech company and make a bunch of money. This is a person on a mission to solve one of the biggest problems, which is people and jobs don't match up. And it's really hard to find that right combination. And he combines it with, deep technical acumen. But at the beginning, he's just an amazing, amazing human being. So, the technology and work and everything is like better than anything I've seen. But what tipped the scales for me was getting to know him and Claire and you.
Lovely. Well, we're so happy it worked and that we got you as an advisor. I will now move on to questions from the audience. We have, as I said, we have a lot and more coming in. So thank you for all your great questions. The first one is from Lu Chen. So you talk about keeping the quality bar high at Google. So can you share how Google ensured consistent interview and hiring quality, even across different regions?
Sure. The key was at any company, people move around, right? No matter how big or small, eventually people are going to like switch jobs and, if nothing else, work cross-functionally. And so the promise of the way hiring worked at Google, and the reason the hiring bar had to remain high, was because anyone who gets hired might end up on my team, or I might end up working with them. So wherever they're getting hired, they need to be good, which means I have an interest, not just in my team, but the teams around me. And so and that was the self-interested motivation. And what would happen is, and I'll tell you about like our hiring mechanism in a second, but when managers came in, Google famously gave managers very little power. And so a manager couldn't make a hiring decision by him or herself. That went to a separate committee. And that was super frustrating when people came in. But 6 months later, they would find, this is amazing. All the people around me are great. I've not met a single person who's slacking, and not a single person. Like, this is a company just filled with talent. And it was because of the hiring process. So 6 months later, they would become fans of it. And the mechanism was this. Somebody would interview for jobs. All their interview feedback would be written up. So what question was asked, what was the answer, and what was the commentary around why is this a good or bad answer, which gives you interviewer quality feedback in addition to just how the candidate do. That goes in a pack. The pack includes all the information about the candidates, and it goes to a hiring committee. And nobody who's going to manage that employee sits on that hiring committee. The hiring committee then reviews. And then in the early days, Larry would review, Larry Page, one of the founders. And then it became the senior executive management group would review, which was the Monday night meeting I alluded to. And the whole purpose of those second reviews was keep the bar high. And that's how we did it. And then every 2 years, I would ask my team to take a stack of 100 to 200 prior packets, anonymize them, take out the dates, the university names, any identifying information, and run them back through the hiring committee. And what we found was we would have hired a fewer and fewer percentage each year, which told us the bar was going up. But that's the key. Have people make the hiring decisions who actually aren't going to be managing that person and instead are charged with just making sure the person's great. Amazon uses something called bar raisers, where they have somebody who's charged with making sure someone's the best. McKinsey has a model where they have 4 criteria, and you have to be in at least as good as average at McKinsey in all of them and top 25% in another. So there's lots of mechanisms, but you got to do it because otherwise you're going to end up a company filled with average performing people, and then your company performance will be average, and nobody wants that.
We have a follow-up question from the audience from Cindy Lopez about hiring committees and taking the manager out of the hiring committee. Can you talk about how to convince my team to move in this direction? There's a lot of pushback that will slow us down.
Oh, it slows you down 100%. It definitely, because it inserts a whole step. But what you get is, you don't have to hire your manager's kid. You don't have to hire a customer's kid. And you only hire people that you're really confident on. So when I joined Google, the sense was the HR function was not the Google function department per se, but sort of the meme in the tech industry was like, HR is not very good. And there was in fact an article written about how, I was going to get fired in a year because nobody could possibly make these Google brainiacs happy. And so the method I took, which I recommend in this case, is just ask for an experiment. Just tell the team, okay, we're going to hire 3 people this year, or 6 people, or 600, whatever. Half of them, why don't we do with a hiring committee? And the other half, we'll just do using our regular method. And then, and this is the trick with a lot of people issues in companies, then you got to wait a year and see how they perform. And the people who go through a hiring committee, if they're doing their job right, are actually going to perform way better. And they're going to be better for your company. And then you can turn around and say, okay, this is clearly better. And you'll also have the numbers saying, well, and it added an average of 3 days to the hiring process because the hiring committee, is it worth it? Because we had to fire, 5% of these other people, 0% of these, and that's your case. But I would start with an experiment because that's much less threatening. And if at the end of the day, they're still resistant, they don't want to do hiring committees, then there's other things to focus on. But that would be a great starting point.
I love the idea of an experiment. It's really smart and hard to argue against. Let's try it out. Okay, next question is from Greg. What are your thoughts on artificial intelligence possibly taking over recruiters and sourcers' jobs?
Ooh, well, first of all, I mean, when you think about AI, it's not really like human intelligence, right? Like what happens is, the better way to think about it is it's super, super high-end sentence completion. It's just pattern matching clusters of words and even, underlying ideas, but there's no sense of a person. There's no motivation. There's no values behind it. So number one, past experiments at most companies with using AI or large language learning models or algorithms to screen candidates have not ended well. Amazon famously, and this was in the press, they famously there was an engineering team that built an algorithm to screen candidates, and they ended up, because they trained on existing employees, they ended up recruiting people who look like existing employees, which meant they screened out Black candidates and female candidates. And they ran that for 2 years. So at their scale, think of all the people who didn't get hired. And when I asked somebody at Amazon about it, they said, well, it was only for 2 years. It's probably like 300,000 people who didn't get hired, right? So the history of being able to have an unbiased system do this is not great. So when you're looking at tools in this space, now, by the way, there's some real applications which make it easier. There was an article today about use AI to generate your cover letters. Okay, sure. So you can make the process more efficient. You can have recruiters doing letters that are algorithmically generated. Fine. I think someone's going to figure this out, and my gut is SeekOut is doing really cool work in this space. The thing to look for is you want a company that has a strong ethical basis. It's really easy to build like a tech recruiting company based on like scraping a bunch of data and getting it in appropriately. And, you can buy like lists of employees and things like, SeekOut's done it the right way. And when a company does it the right way ethically, they're more likely to find applications that are ethical for AI. So I think it's going to end up helping. And some of the demos I've seen from SeekOut actually suggest a lot of intelligence behind the sourcing and assembling things. In terms of recruiter careers, I think it's important to figure out how to use the tools really quickly. And to be able to then add the human in the loop element where you kind of say like, okay, are these outcomes biased? Am I not getting any female candidates or candidates from certain countries? So I think there'll always be a role for the human being. I also think the human being hiring managers also will want the judgment of the recruiters. Like even if the algorithm is perfect, we saw this at Google, people still like the human touch. We just want that social element. So I think it'll eventually make things more efficient. But in the meantime, probably introduce a lot of bias and discrimination. So if you're going to use it with a company that has a proven history of ethical behavior.
Right. Yeah, we like to think of AI assisted as the term, but human driven.
See, that's great. Like that's exactly right. What you don't want to do is give up control to the machine, because I mean, maybe eventually we can trust that, but like self-driving cars they've been working on those for 15 years. And I'm friends with one of the people who founded Google's self-driving car efforts, who then started a company doing it. And since the day I've known this guy starting 16 years ago, he said, it'll be ready in 4 years.
It's always 4 years away.
It's always 4 years away.
Okay, next is a good question from Yulia, which is, can you think of any poor hires at Google? What did you learn from that experience to avoid poor hiring decisions in the future?
There were a ton. Because everything I'm sort of sharing is like, I like to say true at the 90% level. Like we got 3 million resumes a year. So there's going to be some mistakes because we have people working on it and not everything's perfect. I mean, even at Google, we had a senator call and, yell at the policy team and then contact the CEO and say, you got to hire my kid. And, I said no, because we don't, we had a principle that, you have to go through the process. But the head of public policy talked to somebody in the Singapore office and twisted their arm and got this kid like an internship in Singapore. So that was an error. It was both unjust and also the quality of the person was just kind of whatever. But, sitting senator who's still in the Senate reaches out like, somebody's going to crack. We also hired some people who, particularly at the executive level, the impacts are greater. Like you make a hiring decision at the entry level, kind of fine. At the executive level, we hired some people where there was a real big business problem to solve. And we said, oh, we got to hire this person to solve the job, but they weren't a cultural fit. So we hired one person at the senior vice president level. And this person came from a company where they had chief of staff roles. And Google at the time had 0 chiefs of staff. Within 6 months, there were 250 chief of staff jobs created because everyone kind of said like, oh, this person gets one. I want one. I want one. I want one. And then there were plenty of other cases. Oh, sorry, but the lesson, the lesson was, we actually went through a process of every quarter identifying the bottom 5% of people in the company, but it wasn't performance ratings. It was separate from the rating system. It was just secret behind the scenes, identify somebody. And for people in the bottom 5%, we found that for 3 percentage points of them, so for the majority of them, if they switched jobs, their performance actually improved. And their performance went from bottom 5% to average. And so the insight there was, in general, the hiring process, yeah, we made mistakes 2% of the time. 3% of the time, the mistake we made was we just didn't get the right job. So somebody was a finance analyst when they should be a marketing analyst. And once they moved jobs, they performed. So there's a huge opportunity in actually turning all this insight and power everyone watching this has as recruiters on what's happening inside the company. Because too often what happens is you do the recruiting, you hand it off, person goes in the company and you know them, you have the relationship, you know the pros and cons, and that gets forgotten. And so there's a lot of hope I have for turning the kind of power that SeekOut does outside, inside, and doing that kind of good inside companies.
It's really interesting that a majority of it was role fit. Were you able to understand if it was like how much of it was predicted by manager? And
I don't remember there being a pattern to it, but I can't give you an authoritative answer because
Okay.
I may just have forgotten. But the managers were generally, there was a separate piece of work on manager quality and improving managers. So when that started, 57% of our managers were viewed as great, and 2.5 years later, 83% of it was. But that 3 percentage point stayed consistent, which would suggest if the managers were the root cause, that percentage would have shrunk. So I think it was just they were hired into a job that wasn't perfect, or they moved into another job internally. And, that's imperfect as well.
Interesting. Okay, so we have five minutes left. I think we have time for at least one more question from James, which is an interesting one. If you were to write another book, what would it be about?
I mean, this is not sexy, but the book I've always wanted to write, and my publisher said nobody would be interested in, was actually how to get a job. Because my own career was kind of a mess, right? Like, so no sense of like large corporations and things like that. Graduate college and, ended up waiting tables and doing some other stuff, and eventually figured things out over like 3 or 4 years, end up at business school. Then I go to McKinsey, which was my goal. And then I then decide to go into HR and go to GE for my first HR job. Then Google recruited me, which was amazing and an incredible blessing. But because I had such a brutal experience, my first year, business school is 2 years. My first year, I didn't get a single interview, right? I dropped my resume for a bunch of companies. Not a single one wanted to talk to me, even the companies where I was aggressively kissing their butts during the whole first year and organizing events. And I remember the campus lead who was from McKinsey. I said, come on, like, what's going on? He said, well, your resume didn't stand out enough. And I said, but I know you know me. I've been doing all. He said, wasn't in your resume. And so I put a little of this on LinkedIn a long time ago, but there's like very specific things about what goes in the resume, how you interview, like how you figure out like where to target, how you differentiate versus other people. So as you can tell, I want to write that, but I was told it wouldn't sell.
Well, it looks like the audience disagrees and they want to see that book. And I think I would read it too. And I think we're in a market where people want insider tips on how to find that great job that's a mix of fit and purpose. So I think you should go for it.
Well, thank you. Thanks. Maybe one day.
One day. Well, thank you so much for your time. Thank you to the audience for tuning in. I have found this conversation helpful and interesting, and I thank you.
You're very welcome. It's been a joy to be with you and get to know the company more. And I know most of the people who watch this are recruiters or in that field. The work you do is so important. And not always valued as much as it should, but you're knitting the fabric of these companies and cultures. So it's an honor to get to chat with all of you, and thank you to you and SeekOut.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.